Mr. Finan has been involved in the fight against censorship for over 25 years. He is the chair of Media Coalition, a trade association that defends the rights of businesses that produce and distribute First Amendment protected material. A native of Cleveland, Mr. Finan is a graduate of Antioch College. After working as a newspaper reporter, he studied American history at Columbia University, where he received his PhD in 1992. He is the author of Alfred E. Smith, The Happy Warrior, a biography of the New York governor who was the first Catholic to run for president. His latest book is From the Palmer Raids to the Patriot Act, a history of the fight for free speech in America. The winner of the American Library Association's Eli M. Opeler Award for the best work on intellectual freedom, published in 2006 and 2007. Chris is married to Pat Willard, a writer whose most recent book is America Eats, On the Road with the WPA, the fish fries, box supper socials, and chitlin feasts that define real American food. They have 2 sons, and they live in Brooklyn. And I have to give a shout out to one of his sons who happens to be a fellow Marine. So please send a Semper Fi and an Hoorah back to your son. After Mr. Finan speaks, he will be up at the top, just outside the doors. We have his books if you're interested in purchasing them. He is willing to stick around and sign. So please welcome Chris Finan.
Thanks for plugging my wife's book. It always makes it easier to go home, and, when you've been gone for a few days and say, hey, yeah, I've been gone, but we plugged your book. She goes, oh, that's good. I wanted to start with a few thank yous. Of course, I want to thank the Vonnegut Library for inviting me to come out. And they've been doing a great job with Banned Books Week for the last several years, and I was so happy to see that they won a grant from the Free and Read Foundation, which I'm a member of the board, but I did not vote on the grant. I can't tell you, I wasn't paying for my own trip to. I also want to thank Indianapolis Public Library for hosting the event. I always feel safer surrounded by librarians. They make great bodyguards, especially when you're dealing in First Amendment rights. And I have a number of patrons that helped pay for this through funding, internet funding, supporters of the Vonnegut Foundation. And I've been coached in the pronunciation of the names. And if there are any of you here whose names I'm about to butcher, please don't ask for a refund. Shannon Baylor and Brett McLaughlin, Annette and Fred Biesecker, Jennifer and Tony Dazwaner, that was a tough one, Mimi and David Josie, Dan Kirkland, Cammie Kitchen, Jane and Al Worley, Doug White, Julia, and of course, and J.T. Whitehead, and Carl Zimmer. Thank you all for supporting this event. I also want to thank a couple of other people. I want to thank the Baltimore Colts. I was born in Cleveland, but we moved when I was 7 to Denver, and so I've been a Denver Broncos fan since the day they were started as a franchise, and I want to thank the Colts for sending Peyton Manning to us. That was very nice of them, and maybe we'll see you in the playoffs. And I also wanted to thank Governor Daniels for getting his hand caught in the cookie jar and in his efforts to censor Howard Zinn and his books. It's a good laugh to hear him say that what he was really trying to do was to protect Indiana school children from propaganda. I don't think Howard believed in heaven. It's just not kind of his style, but I'm sure wherever he is, he got a good laugh out of that. Banned Books Week was launched a little over years ago to draw attention to the problem, to the fact that book censorship is an everyday problem in America. And this is something that Americans have a hard time getting their minds around, because from an early age, we grow up hearing that this is a country founded on freedom, and that is symbolized by the First Amendment to the Constitution, which protects our freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom of assembly, freedom of petition, freedom, 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 freedom of expression. But the fact is that there has always been censorship in America. And just to give you a taste of that, only a few years after the adoption of the First Amendment, one half of the Founding Fathers, the Federalists, were very busy trying to throw the other half of the Founding Fathers, the Jeffersonians, in jail for using the very freedoms that the First Amendment protects. And a number of newspaper editors ended up in jail for criticizing the administration of President John Adams. So even the Founding Fathers at first didn't know exactly what was entailed in the freedoms that they promised us. And then over the course of the next century, a number of groups really had to fight to be heard, and not always successfully. The abolitionists, who were advocating the elimination of slavery, found themselves attacked when they spoke, their presses broken up, and in some cases, some of them were murdered for their opinions. The Congress of the United States refused to accept their petitions. So if you've got a better example of censorship than that, let me know. A few years later, a group of men and women who today we would call feminists began to advocate for greater equality between the sexes, including reforms in marriage and the right for women to vote. And for that, a number of them were prosecuted under the obscenity laws at the time by our first nemesis, Anthony Comstock, the originator of the first federal censorship law, and who personally went about its enforcement as an inspector for the Postal Service. And then the biggest, probably the largest group of people who were deprived of free speech in this country through the end of the 19th century and into the early 20th century were people who wanted to organize labor unions. All they wanted to do was to meet, to solicit membership, to have the right to picket in support of their demands, and they met nothing but resistance, injunctions, police crackdowns, and attacks by hired thugs. So we've never had freedom of speech in this country, but it didn't really affect it didn't really affect book censorship, books, until the 1920s. And it was in the 1920s that writers began to, particularly fiction writers, began to be increasingly realistic in their depiction of society, and particularly to talk about that one really forbidden subject, sex, and to portray it in their pages. And this aroused such alarm and anger that authorities throughout the country, but particularly in Boston, actually banned their books. Banned them to the point where in Boston became known as Banned in Boston. And I just want to give you a flavor of the subversive writers that they suppressed. D.H. Lawrence, Ernest Hemingway, Theodore Dreiser, Eugene O'Neill, Bertrand Russell, H.G. Wells, Sherwood Anderson, William Faulkner, John Dos Passos, Ben Hecht, Sinclair Lewis, just basically the guys who wrote most of the American canon, the books that we consider our classic works of literature. The fight against censorship of books continued throughout the 30s and the 40s. As late as 1963, booksellers were being arrested for selling Tropic of Cancer, Henry Miller's erotic classic. And it was only then that the Supreme Court finally said okay, adults can read what they want. And I know for the younger people in the crowd that seems like a long time ago, but for others of us that was really not that long ago. But book censorship today, after that Supreme Court decision, book censorship became really a battle in schools and libraries, particularly in the 80s, which was when Banned Books Week got started. There was a pushback against this realism in books, and particularly as those books were made available to kids. And we began to experience hundreds of challenges every year. And at the peak, in the early 80s, there were as many as 800 or 900 challenges a year. And that number has gradually come down because of the fight that we've made. But last year it was 464. So it's more than one a day. So we felt in launching Banned Books Week that we had to do something to draw attention to this problem. And we have our critics. You know, there were people who said, books don't get banned in America. These aren't, you can't, so the fact is they're not available in the schools. That doesn't mean they're banned. And most of these are just challenges anyway, and they're challenges by parents who are concerned about the books that their kids are getting, and so that's not really censorship. Well, books are banned. The Texas ACLU keeps a pretty close count on book challenges and bannings. And according to their count, in the 2011-2012 school year, there were 50 challenges in Texas and 12 outright bans, which they celebrated as progress. They said, that's pretty good. We only lost 12 books last year. In Missouri, where another study was done between 2008 and 2011, there were another 50 books challenged, another dozen or so banned. But that study revealed something else that was particularly worrying, which is that they counted restrictions as well as bans. So that is books put on shelves that could only be accessed with parental permission or moved to another grade level. Or when you count those restrictions as well as the bans, 40% of the books challenged in Missouri were restricted in some way over that period. There is book banning in America. The latest struggle, kind of my point of departure here tonight, is to talk about YA books, young adult books that are intended for kids from 12 to 18. And these are books and first of all, not all YA books get challenged. Not all YA books deal with controversial subjects, but a lot of them do. In many ways, what happened in the 20s as the subject matter of art changed, so did it, for adults, so has that now happened for kids. And art never stands still, and artists are always eager to talk about the problems that they see, and these are increasingly being revealed to kids. Some of the subjects of these YA books that have become so controversial are premarital sex, homosexuality, rape, suicide, violence, addiction. Basically things that we as adults worry about. But these are books intended for kids. And they have stirred quite a hornet's nest of criticism. First of all, the people who are challenging them in schools who are often parents who don't want their kids or anybody else's kids to read these books. But also increasingly there are voices of critics are being heard supporting the effort to cut back on the content of these books. And one of the people who stirred the biggest fuss recently, which was 2 years ago, is a children's book reviewer for the Wall Street Journal, Megan Cox-Gurdon, who published an article called Darkness Too Visible, in which she had this to say: if books show us the world, teen fiction can be like a hall of funhouse mirrors, constantly reflecting back hideously distorted portrayals of what life is. There are, of course, exceptions, but a careless young reader, or one who seeks out depravity, will find himself surrounded by images not of joy or beauty, but of damage, brutality, and losses of the most horrendous kinds. Ms. Gurdon went on to say it's not just, this isn't just a question of distorting real life. This is a matter of spreading information about aberrant behavior and encouraging kids who aren't engaged in that behavior currently to try it out. In other words, it's infecting more and more kids as a result of these books. She also had some not nice things to say about those of us in the publishing industry who are involved in the dissemination of YA books, that is, publishers and booksellers and librarians and teachers. She said that we really don't care about the kids. What we care about is profits and being on the cutting edge, no matter who the cutting edge cuts. It was less a criticism than a diatribe, and it got much, the response to it from part of the defenders of YA books was almost as strong as the criticism itself. Sherman Alexie, who is the author of Absolutely True Diary, a Part-Time Indian, one of the most challenged books in the country right now, and has been ever since it was published, was asked by the Wall Street Journal if he wanted to respond to Gurdon. And he said, yes, I have 2 words for her. And they said, well, we'd like something a little longer than that. So he said, okay. And he wrote a very powerful article. For those of you who don't know Sherman Alexie, this was his first YA book. He was well known at the time as an author for adults. And the book that he wrote was more or less a memoir of his own childhood, which was a pretty depressing childhood. He had grown up on an Indian reservation in the state of Washington. He had been physically abused. He had been sexually abused. And when he finally escaped and started to attend a white school nearby, he was once again isolated by the fact that he was an Indian in an all-white school. And the book is more or less his story. And his first response to Gurdon is that she has no idea what kids are going through today, that she has no familiarity, that shows no interest in their problems, and that his major goal as a writer is to connect with those kids who are in trouble and don't know where to turn and are seeking advice. And this was part of his response. Teenagers read millions of books every year. They read for entertainment and for education. They read because of school assignments and pop culture fads. And there are millions of teens who read because they are sad and lonely and enraged. They read because they live in an often terrible world. They read because they believe, despite the callow protestations of certain adults, that books, especially the dark and dangerous ones, will save them. A little later in the same article, he finished the article this way. He said, I write for teenagers because I vividly remember what it feels like to be a teen facing everyday and epic dangers. I write to give them weapons in the form of words and ideas that will help them fight their monsters. From Alexie's point of view, it's not him that's being immoral. It's Gurdon. And by ignoring the problems that kids face in the modern world, which is a world, very different from, I think, the world that Gurdon grew up in. It's a world immersed in media, some of it very explicit, some of it very sending very mixed signals to kids about what's proper and what's not. A world that, especially if you're poor or a minority, is particularly dangerous. Laurie Halse Anderson is another author who responded to Gurdon. Laurie was the author of two challenge books. One was a book called Speak, about sexual violence, date rape. And Speak had been challenged in Republic, Missouri, actually at the same time as Kurt Vonnegut's Slaughterhouse-Five was challenged, by a guy named Wesley Scroggins, which is a positively Dickensian name. And I don't know what he looked like, but I have a picture in my mind, and it's not pleasant. And he challenged these books, and Laurie's book, Speak, he called soft-core pornography, because it depicted a rape and then an